There is a simple way to understand psychiatric drugs. They are neurotoxins. They poison brain cells, and because they are so neurotoxic, they not only destroy brain cells, which are the most sensitive cells, so they destroy them first. They destroy liver cells often. They destroy thyroid cells often. They can destroy skin cells, produce terrible rashes. So we're talking about very destructive drugs. Now, if you read the label, that is the full prescribing information, which is a document created in partnership between our Food and Drug Administration and the drug companies. You read one of these labels, you find out what a toxin is like, especially a neurotoxin, because there are pages and pages of the manifestations of neurotoxicity. And in fact, since the brain has limited toxic reactions, has infinite creative reactions. It writes Shakespeare, the brain's infinite creative reactions. But when you damage it, it gets very stereotyped. Everything gets simpler and simpler. So all the psychiatric drugs and neurotoxins, they end up with a common final pathway of what happens when you simplify the functioning of the brain. So if you take any neurotoxin, arsenic, it doesn't matter, alcohol, in big enough doses for a long enough time, which psychiatric drugs always do. They always give big enough doses or they wouldn't have their effects. What you get is apathy as the energy, what I call deactivation, as the energy of the person is reduced. You get occasional euphoria, artificial high, which usually diminishes in favor of the apathy. And because they afflict the frontal lobes, because they all massively cross the blood-brain barrier, they're hitting everywhere in the brain. That's why they're different from a knife wound even into the head. They're more damaging than that, because they're infiltrating the whole circulatory system of the brain. It's encapsulated, but every drug is tailored to get in there. So it's going through the brain, it's infiltrating the brain, and it's got to eventually hit all of the emotion and intellectual centers of the brain. And when you do that, the brain just becomes indifferent. It's close to apathy, but it's a little different. You just don't care anymore. You're just not engaged in life anymore. Nothing quite matters to you as much anymore. And then, I think it's because of the frontal lobe injury, you develop what I call medication spellbinding. You develop the inability to understand the effects of the neurotoxin. So the technical term that I use in the literature when I developed this concept is intoxication anosognosia. Anosognosia is a concept that developed in neurology, that when portions of the brain are injured, you may not recognize the injury. Even you get a stroke on one side and the hand doesn't move anymore. You may not even recognize it because something happens that you begin to lose the perception of yourself. Well, when the entire brain is infiltrated with a disease process like encephalitis or a psychiatric drug, and they're very similar. In encephalitis, I've written books and articles in the scientific literature about this. The psychiatric drugs mimic encephalitis. So when you do that, you get this really drastic indifference that eventually becomes intoxication and anosognosia. You don't know what's happening to you. So you get patients who are walking around like zombies on your psychiatric ward, and the patient doesn't understand the depth of this crushing effect. The family does. So the family comes into the hospital, and they have a little meeting with the patient who's sitting there like this. And enough of any drug will do this. You start with the most toxic drugs of all, the so-called antipsychotic drugs. They're simply the most toxic of all. And you get this effect with one dose. You can knock down a dog. You can knock down an ape. You can knock down a frantic person in the emergency room. One dose. That's how toxic they are. One dose. You don't care anymore. No, I'm not going to have no menace to anybody. The patient has no idea what's hit them. They can go on for months like that. They can go on for years like that. Over the years, the quality of life begins to deteriorate, and they don't know it. But their loved ones often know it. Their children know it. And they'll sit in a conference room, and let's say you have a mother, a father, a 10-year-old son, and there's the man, 40 years old, maybe he's divorced, and he's sitting there with his son and his parents maybe, and the social worker, the psychiatrist, the psychologist. So you have a family seminar with 3 or 4 family members, the psychiatrist, the psychologist, the social worker. And everybody in the room knows that the patient who's slumped over like this is practically being killed by the psychiatric drugs. Everybody knows this, except the psychiatrist, the psychologist, the social worker, and the patient. The people who know are the family members. It's an astonishing thing, and we could talk a lot about this, that you can bring up doctors not to know that they are destroying the lives of their patients. Why else would I be the first psychiatrist to ever say to the world, lobotomy is immoral as well as unscientific? There's no evidence it does anything except destroy people. You get in there, you bore a hole. We used to put formaldehyde in people's brains through those holes. By the time I came around and did an international campaign to stop lobotomy and psychosurgery, which I mostly did throughout Europe, Canada, North America, U.S., I came and I debated people in England and so on, and even stopped programs in India and Japan. Before I came along, no psychiatrist in the history of my profession had ever stood up publicly and said, this must be stopped. It slowed down because the drugs cause lobotomies. Remember, there's only just a few ways to damage the brain and a few ways to respond. So you damage the brain if by doing massive cuts in the front or electrical storms in the front or poisoning it. And you're going to get these common effects of apathy, indifference, spellbinding where you don't know what's happening to yourself. Why was I the only one? Why am I still the only psychiatrist to stand up in public and testify in court and say shocking the brain with 10 times now the energy levels we used decades ago, shocking the brain until you cause flatlining, shocking the brain until you flatline. After, of course, a massive seizure exhausts your brain and you flatline, so that you come out in a condition which any reasonable physician would say is severe traumatic brain injury, because it has every characteristic that meets the scientific criteria for severe traumatic brain injury. You have a massive insult to the brain, you have a massive seizure, you have flatlining followed by complete loss of memory for everything surrounding the trauma. Never mind the past that's going to memory loss and the future memory loss. You have confusion, you have disorientation, takes you many minutes to awaken. You awaken in a state where your judgment is gone, where you have to be taken care of by other people. I mean, not 1, not 2, not 3, but 2 or 3 a week, week after week. And somebody wants to claim you need a scientific study, which we have, to show it causes brain damage? What upbringing does it take of a psychiatrist? What does it take so that you don't look at this and say, oh my God, the horror? So all of this raises issues about what is it to be a human being, and I hope that gets touched on. What is it to be a human being? We are so malleable. I remember there's a man I haven't seen in decades who did a study of Norwegian concentration camps. He said, the Norwegians always said during the war how they're terrible Germans. And then when the Germans took control of Norway, they set up a concentration extermination camp right in Norway. And they got plenty of people to participate. And you can bet you anything you could do it in the U.S. I'm certain of it. Not even big changes. We put the Japanese into these terrible camps. Why did we pick them? We hardly put any Germans in. So if you can tell somebody's different, you can do anything in the world you want to. That's human nature. But somehow in medicine, in particular, that has gotten activated over centuries of arrogance and medical control and medical know-it-allness. Then you get somebody like Peter Goetze who comes along, or myself who comes along, and, you know, we just don't know about all that. We're reading stuff about human beings. We want to know what helps them, what hurts them. We're not thinking what's going to empower me. I think that's one of the big differences. We're thinking about how do you save lives? How do you protect people? I remember thinking that as an 18-year-old volunteering in a state mental hospital. How do you protect these people? But most people are thinking, how do I protect myself? And I don't blame them. I don't blame them. I don't make my friends become reformers or something. But this is the complicated nature of human life. I'm getting far afield. Let me talk very briefly about some of the things done to me, because that might be interesting to just get them in. The efforts made to destroy a person who starts out young like me and who has a massive accomplishment, like, you know, preventing the lobotomists from coming back and doing again millions of people around the world. It wasn't just the license attack in '87. When they failed at that, in 1994, I was made the scientific researcher for all the combined suits against Eli Lilly for alleged violence, suicide, mayhem, mania caused by the first of the long line now of newer antidepressants, many of them called SSRIs, but just think of the newer antidepressants because there's many and there's mixed. Once I got that position, I discovered that even though I was now extremely well known on all the television shows, Oprah, I mean, every big television show I was on, morning news, evening news, Dan Rather this didn't matter. I couldn't get a book published. A long struggle began where a few brave publishers, always with the president believing in me of the corporation, would publish me. And I found that Eli Lilly was sending letters to all of the media, linking me to bizarre organizations with which I had nothing to do. And then during this period of time, and I have no idea who to attribute it to. I certainly can't attribute it to Eli Lilly. For one thing, Lilly was just the beginning of multiple other pharmaceutical companies who viewed me especially as being the central and single scientific expert for all the suits against Lee. They viewed me as the person with his finger in the dike, the one person standing up to the antidepressants. You can see how successful I was, huh? I was not successful at all, but I began at least the criticism of it. And during that period of time, my whole family got sick. And I've never talked about this on television before. My whole family, we got sick. My wife and my youngest daughter and me. We got respiratory illness mainly. We couldn't figure out what it was. We went from doctor to doctor to doctor. And finally, a plumber went in our basement. And he came back, looking white. And do you know, he said, that the chimneys from both your water heater and your home oil burner have been removed and hidden or placed behind the heaters and the furnace? No, we didn't. And of course, he immediately, it wasn't hard, just put them back in place and said they're going to have to be re-cemented. They're not cemented into place anymore. We were so bamboozled at the time, I don't think we never reported this. We never spoke about it. It was like, oh my God, this is the world we're in. What do we do? Later on, when the death threats became very specific, we're going to kill you, I'm going to kill your family at Christmas, this coming Christmas, this is October, November. We called the FBI. It was less cowed later on. We get the FBI in. I tell them, we get the FBI in, I tell them, I think I know who this is. I think this is a very important celebrity who's being used by by the drug companies because I've been up against them. The FBI, and I gave them the name. The FBI said, sorry, we're not going to do that. We're not going there. I said, oh, and we talked to them some more. And they left. And then we called back. The FBI, they had no record of the meeting. They had no idea what we were talking about. Oh my God, this is what we're up against. And later on, I went and I did freedom of information with the FBI. What's in my file? The only thing in my file was that I had signed a letter protesting the Vietnam War while I was in a uniformed service, which was illegal. I knew it when I signed the letter in the Washington Post. Here I was in uniformed service, but I wanted to protest what was going on in that war, and so I signed a letter, and that's what they had in there. They didn't have anything else. At least nothing they sent to me. So there were times when I consulted about wearing a flak vest and carrying a gun. See, America, you can sometimes carry a gun. But I decided, and in the discussions, that there's really no way to defend yourself against a single assassin. There is no way. So I don't understand why I'm alive. I don't understand why I've come to this point in time after all these years. But I would say that it's a very good life. I mean, it is a very good life. I will not at 82 look back and say, wish I'd done more. I look back and I think, what in the world? How did that all happen? How did I do that?